Today I'm going to share with you what I've learned supporting hundreds of patients through protracted withdrawal over the last 4 years. Now, when I initially started treating this condition, it shook me to my core because of the severe distress in this patient population. Now, it doesn't scare me so much, even though I still have my moments of overwhelm. When I've thought about what I'm doing with these patients, usually it's a slow taper, but I find that I'm seeing them all the time, sometimes several times a week. And the medical treatment, what I'm doing with the medications isn't really that much. So I started to think closely about what I'm actually doing with them. And I think a lot of it is actually grieving. So I started to look at this through the paradigm of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grieving. And while not everyone may go through these stages, I think it's a reasonably good outline of some of the things people go through during recovery from protracted withdrawal and what I encounter a lot as I support them. Now, with the 5 stages of grief, they don't usually happen in the same order all the time, and sometimes they can be overlapping, so it's really a rough framework. Let's dive into it and begin. So, within the first couple of weeks to months of developing protracted withdrawal, usually people go through the denial phase. What this usually is patients are frantically looking for answers to what has happened to them. They want to know if there's other causes, why are they suffering so seriously? They usually go online, they start to try and learn about protracted withdrawal. They'll go and see a million different doctors and specialists. They'll just see if it could be something else, anything else. And usually how I support people through this phase is by letting them go through the motions and see all of the specialists to make sure they rule out any other medical problems. I usually try and give them all the information and resources that they need about protracted withdrawal so they can see if that's the best fit for their symptoms, because I could tell them that I think they have protracted withdrawal, but really they have to arrive at that conclusion on their own by going through the motions and doing their due diligence. Usually after they've accepted that they have a protracted withdrawal diagnosis, they move on to what I call the anger phase. Now, this is usually characterized by a lot of anger at the physician who prescribed them this medication. It's very common for people to have thoughts such as, how could they put me on this if it was so dangerous? Why didn't they tell me about the risks? Never would have done this if I knew something like this could happen to me. And during this stage, the person usually starts thinking that their doctor was negligent or maybe even malicious. However, if they learn more, they'll realize that not just their doctor, but many other doctors are unaware of this. Usually this is by going online and hearing stories from others. This throws them down a rabbit hole where they realize that maybe the education of doctors isn't that great, and they start to have this huge disenchantment with medical doctors and the system in general. They lose faith in institutions like the FDA and the whole institution of medicine as a whole. And usually the best way to support someone through this stage is to help them understand why this happened, because I think patients really understand the pervasive influence of the pharmaceutical industry on what doctors are learning, and also the commercial influences of private equity and how doctors are made to see patients so quickly. They don't realize how the entire system, not just their doctor, has actually been heavily corrupted in a way where it actually harms many people, and that it is truly unlucky that they were snared up in this. And so what they eventually come to see is that their doctor isn't evil, but rather they're working in a system that is inherently corrupt and malfunctioning. The next stage is bargaining. Now, during this phase, the person is typically looking for outs. They've decided that the pain is simply intolerable and they will not settle for living this way. They frantically start looking for answers for ways to get out of the distress and pain. Usually, they become very interested in things like supplements, and they'll try many of them. This is driven by an urge to try and gain control over the situation, a situation that is so painful, the only natural human response is to look for ways to control it. I've seen patients become very interested in things like stem cell treatments. They think about going overseas to get these cures. And they also get pulled into other fringe medical things. So, I have a lot of patients who go and see lots of alternative practitioners. Some of them get diagnosed with Lyme disease, mold, or other fuzzy non-specific diagnoses. And during this time, I actually think it's just best to gently support them. I'll let them go and see these other doctors. I'll say, yeah, it could be that, but it could also just be protracted withdrawal. And if the interventions are harmless, I let them go through the motions just to see if these things are going to be helpful for them. But what I always emphasize during this process is that I've seen so many people recover without any of these things. I've seen people recover without supplements. I've seen people recover without stem cells or anything like that. And so what I really want to emphasize to them is that they do not need to seek additional things and that their body really has the natural capacity to heal. Usually during this phase, the only advice I give patients is that they should stick to a healthy diet if possible and try and avoid things like caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. Although, again, these are not absolute essentials. We've seen people recover from this while chain smoking and eating McDonald's every day. But I just think generally being healthy will put your body in the best place to recover from protracted withdrawal injury. After the bargaining phase comes depression. Usually this is the point where they realize that they have protracted withdrawal and that there is no cure except time. At this point, they've seen so many doctors who haven't been able to diagnose them with anything, and they've tried lots and lots of supplements, which they're really unsure whether they're working or making any difference. They've also probably met several people online who are in recovery. They've formed friendships, and they've begun to realize through the stories from other people that there's no real shortcuts out of this. Typically, this phase is characterized by intense grief and sadness. It's characterized by feelings such as, I've ruined my life, I've ruined my family's life, and constant suicidal thoughts. Things like, I would rather die than go through what I'm suffering right now. During this phase, patients need ample support and empathy. They need support from people who understand what's going on. This is really where I think the online support communities are essential, because you can talk to other people who are going through what you're going through and gain that empathy and support from them. This phase can be very long. It can last many months or sometimes even up to a year. This state of depression is almost like grieving. It's as if someone has died because you are grieving a life that has been lost. It's also a phase that's incredibly difficult for family members who don't know how to support the injured person, and they're usually getting pretty burnt out and depressed themselves by all of the grief this has caused. Very important during this phase that family members are educated on what protracted withdrawal is, so they have a realistic expectation on what to expect from the person during recovery. It's important to work with the family at this time to tell them how to support the injured person. Typically, it's with a lot of reassurance. I coach family members to say things frequently such as, I love you, I'm going to be here for you no matter how ugly things get, and there is nothing that's going to make me give up on you, and I'm going to be with you the entire time it takes to recover. Patients need to hear this several times a day. It's because the pain is just so severe that many of them are questioning whether they even want to make it through it. Now, the final stage of all of this is acceptance. Now, this is usually when the person realizes that there's no shortcut and there's no quick fix that's going to save them from this condition, and that the only way to survive is by going through the pain. Typically during this stage, people become a lot calmer. Now, it's not because the pain has lessened in any meaningful way, but it's because they are less afraid of what has happened to them. At this stage, the person has also resolved that they're not going to end their life, and they've stepped away from that constant back and forth questioning about whether their life is really worth living with this pain. And so they've stopped worrying about that as much. They've also accepted the diagnosis, and they know they need potentially several years to recover from this. This is an incredibly hard pill to swallow, and that's why it takes so long to get to this depression phase where you really have to grieve your current situation and accept the road ahead. Next, they stop fighting the diagnosis and they start to think about ways they can better live with the pain and better ways their family can also live with what's going on. They start to realize they need to preserve their in-person support system. They may even complain less and less about symptoms. Again, usually not because they're out of pain or anything like that, but because they're noticing that the constant negativity is burning out the people around them. At this stage, they may have to start allowing the support system to go on and live their lives because they really care for them and they don't want to burn them out with the constant caregiver duties. Usually by this stage, they've also started to develop some friends from the online communities, other people going through protracted withdrawal injury, and they realize that they can talk about their struggles with these new friends. And ideally, in the acceptance phase, they get to a point where they realize that although the pain that they're experiencing is not something they can do much about, they actually have control over the effect it has on their life. Usually at this stage, they start to push themselves to start to rejoin the world and have as much of a life as they can handle. Rejoining the world can be very scary, but the distractions from the symptoms can be very helpful. At this point, they're tired of the all-consuming effect that this illness has had on their life and their family. Despite the immense suffering, they talk about it less and less, and they try to focus on enjoying whatever aspects of their life they can. Lots of positive encouragement is needed during this phase, but especially the person going through this needs to be very compassionate with themselves as they test their boundaries and figure out what they can and cannot do. The next stage is recovery. So eventually the pain and the symptoms from the protracted withdrawal injury start to recover, and the person is immensely relieved. If they've been lucky enough to have survived this with their friends and family intact, the gratitude and love that they have for them is overwhelming. For some patients, even though the pain starts to leave, they'll notice that the lessons and the insights that they have learned from going through such an enduring period of pain have stayed. Many sufferers will also emerge with a heightened sense of gratitude for their life and health in general. The experience of working with patients with protracted withdrawal has been truly humbling. It has been probably one of the most rewarding things I've done with my career, is actually to stand beside people going through this every single day, the immense pain, the suffering in the family, and the depression. For some people, it could also be a journey of a lot of personal growth and transformation, especially when they get out the other side. It's very hard to see that when you're in there. And so I want to end this by saying, if there's anyone out there in the depths of protracted withdrawal suffering from this, I just want to remind you that for the vast majority of people, they will experience a substantial or full recovery. They will go on to live meaningful lives, and that you just need to trust your body, take it one day at a time, and that you do have the strength to heal.